I want you to stop whatever you're doing right now. Put your phone down. Actually, no. Pick it up. You're going to need to share what I'm about to tell you, because this morning I woke up and started going through my normal routine, coffee, headlines, emails, and I came across something that made me put that coffee down and just sit there, staring at my screen for a long time. I've been doing this for years, covering politics, power, money, and the stories that the people in charge hope you never connect the dots on. And in all that time, I have never, not once, seen a combination of events like the ones that unfolded in the last 24 hours. The Prime Minister of Canada stood at a podium this morning and publicly accused the President of the United States of running a corruption scheme from inside the White House. And he didn't just say it. He brought 247 pages of evidence to prove it. And then, and this is the part that stopped me cold, Warren Buffett, a man who has never once commented on a sitting president's legal or ethical controversies in 70 years of public life, broke that silence with a statement so precise, so devastating, and so deliberate that legal analysts are already calling it the most damaging endorsement of a corruption allegation ever made by a private citizen in the history of American politics. I'm going to walk you through every single piece of this. The dossier, the cover-up, the Buffett statement, the fallout, and what it all means for the future of this country. But I need you to stay with me, because this isn't a story you can understand in a headline. And if you try, you'll miss the part that actually matters. So let me take you back to where this actually began. Because the story of how Mark Carney found this corruption is almost as extraordinary as the corruption itself. It didn't start with a leak. It didn't start with a whistleblower walking into a newspaper office with a thumb drive. It started with something so mundane that it almost got ignored entirely. It started with trade negotiations. Routine, grinding, deeply technical US-Canada trade negotiations. The kind of diplomatic work that happens constantly between the two countries and almost never makes the news. Wonky stuff about tariff classifications, supply chain rules, manufacturing exemptions. The kind of meetings where everyone wears dark suits and argues over decimal points and spreadsheets. But here's what I want you to understand about those kinds of meetings. The people in them are trained. They're trained to spot when something doesn't add up, when the other side is making arguments that don't align with their actual economic interests, when a position is being held not because it makes logical sense, but because someone somewhere has a different motivation that isn't written on the agenda. And that's exactly what Canadian trade analysts started noticing across the table from their American counterparts. Certain demands didn't make economic sense. Companies that should have been fighting aggressively for tariff relief, conspicuously quiet, as if they'd already been taken care of through some other channel that nobody was talking about. Meanwhile, other companies that had no obvious stake in the specific tariff categories being discussed, were suddenly showing up in meetings they had no business attending, making arguments that didn't match their actual operations, lobbying furiously for exemptions to tariffs that by any logical measure barely affected them. I've spent time understanding how trade negotiations work, and let me tell you, this kind of illogic has a name. It's called a second track. It means someone is operating outside the official framework. Someone is running a parallel game. And that's precisely the term that Canadian intelligence analysts started using when they brought their findings up the chain. A parallel process. At this point, CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, was already conducting routine monitoring of communications surrounding the trade negotiations. I want to be clear about what that means because it matters. This isn't adversarial spying between allied nations engaged in high-stakes economic negotiations. This kind of intelligence monitoring is standard practice. It's the diplomatic equivalent of due diligence. And what CSIS analysts found during that monitoring was not what they expected. They found internal references in communications between American trade officials to a second track of negotiations happening entirely outside official channels. A parallel process involving Trump-connected intermediaries. Private meetings with companies seeking tariff exemptions, conducted completely outside the formal negotiation framework, outside congressional oversight, outside the view of the career civil servants who were supposed to be managing the trade relationship. I remember when I first read this part of the timeline, I had to go back and reread it twice, because the implications are staggering. Think about what this means. While the official U.S. trade delegation was sitting across the table from their Canadian counterparts, arguing, deadlocking, going through the formal motions of international trade policy. A completely separate set of conversations was happening behind closed doors, a shadow negotiation, a shadow process, running simultaneously, invisibly, and for the benefit of people who were never supposed to be in those rooms. That's the moment this story went from a trade anomaly to an intelligence matter. And over the next several months, CSIS and the Canadian Foreign Ministry began assembling what would become the dossier, not just from their own intelligence channels, from a source inside the American government itself. A senior American trade official, someone who had spent decades in public service, who had built their career on the premise that the institutions they served were worth serving, had been watching this corruption unfold from the inside, and they could no longer stay silent. During a diplomatic exchange in Ottawa, this person, whose identity remains protected under Canadian intelligence protocols, quietly provided corroborating documents to their Canadian counterparts. I want you to think about what that took. This wasn't a political operative with an agenda. This wasn't someone trying to damage a rival. This was a career civil servant, someone who had given their professional life to the government of the United States. And they looked at what was happening inside their own institution and decided that their oath to the Constitution mattered more than their loyalty to any administration. That decision, that quiet, private, enormously consequential decision, is the reason we're having this conversation today. The completed dossier, 247 pages, was reviewed by Canadian legal experts, vetted by CSIS leadership, and crucially, shared in advance with key Commonwealth intelligence partners in the United Kingdom and Australia for independent verification. Both confirmed the documentary evidence was authentic. Now here's where I need you to pay very close attention, because this next part tells you everything about what we're actually dealing with. Mark Carney is not a political firebrand. He's not a showman. He's a former central banker, one of the most respected financial minds on the planet. He runs on caution, precision, and protocol. He doesn't make dramatic gestures. So when he had this dossier in hand, his first instinct was not to release it to the press. His first instinct was to handle it quietly. He followed diplomatic protocol to the letter. He notified the White House through the Canadian ambassador that irregularities had been detected in the trade negotiations. He requested a private, discreet discussion to resolve the matter bilaterally. Now, I want you to imagine you're the Trump administration receiving that message. You've just been informed by a foreign government that they detected irregularities in your trade process. What do? If you're clean, you investigate. You ask questions. You say, "Tell us more. We want to get to the bottom of this." If you're not clean, if there's something to hide, you do something else entirely. The Trump administration's response was immediate. It was decisive. And it was, in the estimation of every legal analyst I read since this broke, deeply categorically incriminating. They didn't investigate. They didn't ask questions. They didn't express concern. They covered it up. Step 1. Classify. Communications related to the back-channel negotiations were retroactively reclassified as national security-sensitive material. Just like that, they were removed from the reach of congressional oversight committees, shielded from Freedom of Information Act requests, hidden behind a wall of secrecy that was built to protect genuine national security secrets, and was instead being used to protect the president from accountability. Step 2. Reassign. 2 senior career trade officials who had internally raised concerns about the parallel track were quietly moved to unrelated positions within weeks of Carney's notification. No explanation, no accusations, no formal process, just gone. Efficiently, cleanly, and with what anyone who's ever worked in a bureaucracy would recognize as unmistakable intent. Step 3. Threaten. Canadian embassy staff who had reported the irregularities through proper diplomatic channels began receiving signals, conveyed through intermediaries, through subtle shifts in diplomatic tone, that experienced diplomats immediately recognized as warnings. Further inquiry will have consequences for the broader bilateral relationship. That's how power speaks when it wants you to stop looking. Step 4. And this is the one that made my jaw drop when I read it. Silence. The Trump administration formally requested that the Canadian government sign non-disclosure agreements covering all informal communications related to the trade negotiations. Let me say that again. The United States government asked a foreign sovereign nation to sign an NDA to cover up corruption. I've been writing about politics for a long time. I have never seen that before. Legal analysts are calling it the single most incriminating element of the entire cover-up. Because an NDA between governments has no legitimate diplomatic purpose. None. Zero. You don't ask a foreign government to sign a non-disclosure agreement unless you are desperately trying to prevent something specific from being disclosed. Classify, reassign, threaten, silence. That's not crisis management. That's not damage control. That is a sitting president of the United States using the classification authority, the personnel power, and the full diplomatic machinery of the most powerful government on earth to hide evidence of his own corruption. And when Carney saw that, when he watched the cover-up unfold in real time, he made his decision. The quiet path was closed. The proper channels had been used to bury the evidence, and so he did what needed to be done. He released the dossier simultaneously to the Washington Post, the Financial Times, the BBC, and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. And then he walked to the podium. I've spent hours going through what's been reported from the dossier's contents, and I want to walk you through the 3 major corruption schemes it describes, because the specifics are more damning than any summary can convey. The first is what investigators are calling the tariff exemption kickback pipeline. Here's how it worked. Companies seeking exemptions from steel and aluminum tariffs, exemptions that are entirely legitimate under trade law and are supposed to be granted based on economic merit through a transparent process, were being quietly directed through unofficial channels to a network of Trump-connected consulting firms. These firms, several of which were established in the months immediately following the tariff announcements, as if they'd been set up for exactly this purpose, charged advisory fees ranging from 2 to 5% of the projected tariff savings. Think about what that means in dollar terms. A company expecting to save $100 million in tariffs would pay $2 to $5 million in advisory fees to a consulting firm whose only qualification was its proximity to the president's inner circle. And the fees weren't going to legitimate consultants. Canadian forensic accountants traced the money flows through shell companies registered in Delaware and Wyoming, through the consulting firms, through a network of deliberately obscured entities, and they led back to one place. Entities connected to Trump family members and major political donors. One case in the dossier is devastating in its clarity. A mid-sized American manufacturing company paid a $4.7 million advisory fee to one of the connected consulting firms. Within 3 weeks, that company received a tariff exemption worth approximately $180 million in projected savings. 3 weeks. That's not consulting. That's not policy expertise. That is a toll booth. You want access to your own government's exemption process, a process that's supposed to be transparent and merit-based. You pay the fee, and the fee flows directly into the pockets of the president's personal network. The dossier identifies at least 14 companies that followed this same path. Pay the fee, get the exemption, and never mention it to anyone. The second scheme is what I find personally most staggering. The secret mineral deal. While the public trade negotiations between the U.S. and Canada were deadlocked, while Carney and Trump's trade representatives were publicly fighting over tariff rates, a secret parallel negotiation was underway behind the scenes. Trump-affiliated intermediaries were negotiating preferential access to Canadian critical minerals, lithium, nickel, cobalt, for a consortium of companies with direct and traceable ties to the Trump organization. The consortium would pay 30 to 40% below prevailing commodity market rates, a discount worth hundreds of millions of dollars over the life of the arrangement. Profits flowing through a chain of limited liability companies that Canadian investigators painstakingly traced back to entities controlled by Trump family members. I want you to sit with that for a moment. The President of the United States was using international trade negotiations that affect the livelihoods of millions of Americans and Canadians, as cover for securing personal business deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The tariffs weren't just bad policy. They were a distraction. The chaos, the public fighting, the headlines about trade wars, it was a smokescreen. The real transaction was happening in the shadows while everyone was watching the theater. The third scheme is what the dossier calls diplomatic extortion. The evidence here includes internal communications, time-stamped memoranda, and email chains with metadata, all showing that Trump personally directed diplomatic pressure on Canadian officials to fast-track permits for a Trump-branded luxury development project near Toronto. American trade representatives were instructed to not state directly, but imply through carefully constructed diplomatic language that the broader trade negotiations would be less productive if the Canadian regulatory timeline for the development project experienced delays. And there's one specific internal communication from a senior Trump advisor that is reproduced in full in the dossier. 11 words that are now appearing on front pages around the world. Make sure Ottawa understands the connection between their regulatory timeline and our flexibility at the table. 11 words. Read them again. That is not diplomacy. That is extortion. That is using the economic weight of the United States of America, the jobs, the prices, the prosperity of hundreds of millions of people as leverage for a real estate deal. 3 schemes, 3 distinct abuses of power. Each of them, on its own, would be a major scandal. Together, they describe something that constitutional scholars are struggling to find a historical parallel for. Now I need to talk about Warren Buffett, because I think some people heard his name in connection with this story and thought, okay, famous businessman comments on politics, that's not unusual. And I need to correct that misunderstanding immediately because it profoundly undersells what happened today. Warren Buffett is 94 years old. He has been one of the most prominent and recognizable figures in American business and public life for over half a century. He has lived through Watergate, Iran-Contra, the Clinton impeachment, both of Trump's impeachments, multiple criminal indictments, financial crises, and political catastrophes too numerous to count. In all of that time, through every scandal, every crisis, every moment when commentators and public figures were asked to weigh in on the legal and ethical conduct of sitting presidents, Warren Buffett maintained one absolute rule. He did not comment, not once in 70 years. He believed fundamentally that the institutions of American governance, the courts, the Congress, the Department of Justice, would ultimately self-correct, that the system had built-in mechanisms for accountability, that his job was to invest in that system, not to adjudicate its failures. And this morning, he broke that rule. The moment I read that, before I even read what he said, I felt it. That gravitational shift, because the fact that Buffett chose this scandal, this specific moment to speak, tells you more about the severity of this dossier than any legal analysis could. Let me read you what he said, because I think his exact words deserve to be heard carefully. I've spent my career studying businesses, how they're run, how they succeed, and how they fail. The pattern described in the Canadian dossier is one I've seen 100 times in the private sector. When leadership enriches itself at the expense of the organization it was entrusted to serve, the organization eventually collapses. It doesn't matter how big the organization is. It doesn't matter how strong it appears from the outside. Once the leadership is looting the treasury, collapse is a matter of time. The only difference here is that the organization is the United States government. I want to acknowledge something about those words. They're clinical. They're calm. There's no outrage, no theatrical indignation. They read like a diagnosis, the kind of diagnosis a doctor delivers after reviewing test results, when the outcome is clear and the time for uncertainty has passed. Then he continued, "The cover-up concerns me more than the corruption itself. Corruption can be prosecuted. Corruption can be punished. Individual corrupt actors can be identified and removed. But when a government actively uses its classification authority, its personnel power, and its diplomatic leverage to hide evidence of wrongdoing from its own citizens and its own Congress, you're no longer dealing with a corrupt individual. You're dealing with a corrupt system. And corrupt systems, in my experience, don't reform themselves. They have to be reformed from the outside." And then the third statement, the one that was read aloud on the floor of the Senate within hours of its release. Trust is the foundation of every institution, every company, every government, every alliance. What this dossier describes is the systematic destruction of that trust for personal profit. And once trust is destroyed, the institution follows. I have watched it happen to companies I've invested in. I have watched it happen to industries. I pray it does not happen to this country, but I will not pretend the danger isn't real. I've read a lot of public statements in my time. I've analyzed language for a living, and I will tell you plainly, those 3 paragraphs in sequence from this specific person represent something I have never seen before. Warren Buffett just compared the Trump administration to a failing company where management is looting the treasury while assuring shareholders that everything is fine. He said the cover-up proves this isn't one bad actor. It's a captured institution. A government where the machinery of power has been deliberately turned into an instrument of personal enrichment. And he isn't just talking, he's acting. Berkshire Hathaway's compliance team has already begun a comprehensive review of every government contract held by every Berkshire subsidiary, BNSF Railway, Berkshire Hathaway Energy, Precision Castparts, dozens of others, to ensure that none of them pass through the tainted exemption process described in the dossier. Think about what that means. The most respected businessman in American history has decided he needs to audit his own company's relationship with the federal government because he can no longer trust the government to be operating honestly. That is not a political statement. That is a corporate governance emergency. That is a five-alarm institutional fire. And now the fallout, because in the hours since this dossier was released, the world has been moving very fast. In Congress, the reaction split along predictable lines, but with fractures that I think are deeply significant. Democrats immediately called for a special counsel, subpoenas for every official named in the dossier, and a formal impeachment inquiry. But the more telling reaction came from the Republican side of the aisle. Several senators who have been reliably loyal to Trump through every previous controversy, senators who have used the phrase witch hunt more times than I can count, publicly called for, and I'm going to quote directly, a full and transparent investigation into the allegations. I need you to understand why that language matters. They didn't say witch hunt. They didn't say foreign interference. They didn't say this is an attack on America. They said full and transparent investigation. When your allies switch from witch hunt to we need to get to the bottom of this, the ground is shifting beneath the president's feet. Watch the language. The language is always the early indicator. The cooperating witnesses are multiplying. The senior American official who provided documents to Canada was not alone in their concerns. They were simply the first to act. Within 48 hours of the dossier's release, two additional American officials retained attorneys and signaled their willingness to cooperate with investigators. And one of the reassigned trade officials, one of the people who was punished, quietly, for raising internal concerns, filed a formal whistleblower complaint with the Inspector General, alleging both retaliation and obstruction. Here's what I want you to understand about that development. Every person who was reassigned, every person who was threatened, intimidated, or silenced is now a potential cooperating witness, and they are angry, not in a performative political way, angry in the deep personal way that people get angry when they try to do the right thing through the right channels, and were punished for it. The cover-up created its own enemies. Internationally, the reaction has been seismic. The European Union, Japan, and South Korea have all formally requested access to the dossier through diplomatic channels, because the obvious question is now unavoidable. If this scheme operated in US-Canada trade negotiations, did it operate in ours too? Every American trading partner on Earth is now asking whether their bilateral negotiations included a shadow track, whether there were fees being paid, whether there were deals being cut in the background, while their diplomats argued with American counterparts in good faith at a table that may have been fundamentally meaningless. And Mark Carney, who could have been dismissed as an opportunist, who could have been framed as a foreign actor trying to interfere in American politics, has instead emerged as something that the framing could never diminish. He did what American institutions failed to do. The Prime Minister of Canada exposed corruption that the FBI, the DOJ, and the entire congressional oversight apparatus somehow missed entirely. And here is the question that I keep coming back to, the one that I think will define how historians look back at this moment, regardless of what happens next. Why didn't American institutions catch this first? I want you to think about that seriously, not as a rhetorical jab, but as a genuine question that deserves a genuine answer. Because the Inspector General system was created for exactly this purpose. Congressional oversight committees have subpoena power and dedicated investigative staff. The DOJ's Public Integrity Section and the FBI's Public Corruption Unit exist specifically to detect this type of misconduct. These aren't underfunded small offices. They are staffed with career professionals equipped with serious legal tools and funded by the American taxpayer to do one job. And yet a corruption scheme involving at least 14 companies, millions of dollars in kickback fees routed through shell entities in multiple states, a secret mineral deal worth hundreds of millions, diplomatic extortion documented in real time, and a four-step cover-up coordinated across multiple government departments, all of it went completely undetected by every single American watchdog institution. A foreign intelligence service found it. Canada found it. That fact alone, regardless of your politics, regardless of how you feel about Trump or Carney or any of the individuals involved, should shake you. Because the failure isn't partisan, it is structural. If the system can't catch corruption this blatant, this extensively documented, this operationally reckless, then either the system is broken or the system has been captured. And Warren Buffett, the man who has spent 70 years studying exactly how institutions fail, already told us which one he believes. So here is where we stand right now. The Canadian Prime Minister released 247 pages of evidence exposing a corruption scheme inside United States trade policy, tariff kickbacks funneling millions through shell companies to Trump-connected entities, a secret below-market mineral deal worth hundreds of millions, diplomatic extortion for a private real estate project, and a systematic four-step cover-up involving classification abuse, whistleblower retaliation, diplomatic intimidation, and an NDA demand between sovereign governments. Warren Buffett broke a 70-year personal rule to call it what it is, a captured institution being looted by its own leadership. Cooperating witnesses are emerging. Congressional investigations are launching. International allies are demanding answers. The 14 companies named in the dossier are mobilizing legal teams, and the cover-up that was supposed to make this disappear is instead providing the roadmap for prosecutors. I'll leave you with this. You can survive a scandal. Scandals have a beginning, a middle, and an end. They generate heat, then they burn out. But what Buffett described, a captured institution, a government converted from a public trust into a private enterprise, that doesn't end on its own. It ends when the people it was built to serve decide they won't accept it anymore. The evidence is public now. It exists in 4 languages on every news desk in the world. It can't be classified. It can't be reassigned to a desk in the basement. It can't be silenced with an NDA. The cover-up was supposed to make this disappear. Instead, it made it undeniable, and undeniable has a way of becoming unavoidable. I'll be following this story as it develops. Hit subscribe, because the next 2 weeks are going to be some of the most consequential in modern American political history. I'll see you there.